The wind had teeth that morning, and it bit through the thin planks of the buildings in Redemption Gulch, carrying a cruel mix of dust from the plains and the promise of more snow from the gray. Bruised sky. It was a wind that scoured a man down to his bones, and Thomas Carter felt it in his soul. He stood outside the saloon, his shoulders slumped not just from the cold, but from the crushing weight of his own ruin. Across from him, Silas Blackwood sat easily on his horse, a man carved from the same hard granite as the mountains to the west, his face impassive beneath the brim of his hat. "The debt stands, Thomas," Blackwood said, his voice flat, emotionless. It was colder than the wind. "The deed to your land, it's mine." Thomas Carter's land was not much, 160 acres of stubborn soil that had taken his wife's health and his own youth. But it was his. It was all he had left of a life that had once held promise. Now, thanks to a foolish night of whiskey and cards, it was gone. He had played against men who knew how to win, and in the end, he had played against Luke Harden, a man who did not seem to care if he won or lost, which made him the most dangerous player of all. Harden had won the final, terrible hand, taking the deed, and had then sold it to Blackwood before the sun came up, for a price no one spoke of. "Silas, please," Thomas begged, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Give me more time. A good harvest." Blackwood almost smiled. It was a twitch of his lips that held no warmth. "Your land has not seen a good harvest in 5 years. You have nothing. Your credit is dust." He looked past Thomas, his gaze landing on the small figure standing in the doorway of the dry goods store. Eleanor, his daughter. She was 18, with her mother's wide, solemn eyes and a quiet strength that her father had long since squandered. Blackwood's gaze lingered. An idea, cold and practical, formed behind his eyes. "You have one thing left," he said slowly. Thomas followed his gaze, and a new, sharper kind of cold, one that had nothing to do with the weather, pierced his heart. "No, not Ellie. Anything but that. I am not the one who wants her," Blackwood clarified, dismounting from his horse with a soft thud of boots on the frozen earth. "But Luke Harden does. He saw her in town last month. Asked about her." Blackwood's tone was that of a man trading livestock. "Harden is a man of particular tastes. He wants a wife, a quiet one. He holds the note on my own south pasture. He is willing to forgive that debt, a substantial one, in exchange for the deed to your land, and he will give that deed back to you." Thomas stared, uncomprehending. "What does he want in return?" "Her," Blackwood said, nodding once toward the store. "Your daughter. He will take her as his wife, and your land will be yours again. Your reputation will be saved. No one need know how close you came to the edge." The devil's bargain hung in the air, shimmering with horror and a desperate, ugly temptation to sacrifice his only child to a man like Luke Harden. The stories about Harden were whispered in hushed tones around town. He was a gunslinger, a man who had appeared out of the wastes a few years back with a past he never spoke of and a silence that was more menacing than any threat. He lived alone on a homestead miles from anyone, a place people said was haunted by the ghosts of his own making. He was known for a violent temper that could flare like a brush fire, and it was said he had killed men for less than a crooked look. To give Ellie to him was to hand her over to a monster. But the alternative? To lose the land, to become a beggar, to face the shame and destitution, to see the disappointment in Ellie's eyes turn to pity. Thomas Carter was a weak man, and his pride was the only thing he had left to protect. He looked at his daughter, who was watching them now, her brow furrowed with concern. She was all that was good in his life, and he was about to break her. "I accept," Thomas whispered, and the wind snatched the words away, as if ashamed to let them linger. The ride to Luke Harden's homestead was a journey into silence. Ellie sat on the rough wooden seat of the wagon, her father's shame a palpable presence beside her. He had not been able to meet her eyes when he told her. He had spoken of duty, of family, of saving them from ruin. But his words were hollow, and they both knew it. She had simply nodded, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest. There was no one to appeal to, no other path to take. She was a daughter of the West, and she knew that sometimes survival was the only choice available, no matter the cost. She clutched the two things she owned in the world. Across her lap lay her mother's shawl, its wool worn thin and smelling faintly of lavender and wood smoke, a ghost of a comforting embrace. In her hands, she held her mother's Bible, its leather cover cracked and softened by years of use, the whole thing bound together with a piece of twine. It was a fragile shield against the terrifying unknown that awaited her. The landscape grew more desolate with every mile. The last signs of civilization fell away, replaced by a vast, frozen expanse of plains that stretched to a horizon that looked like the edge of the world. The sky was a merciless, unforgiving sheet of gray. Here and there, a skeletal tree clawed at the air, its branches coated in ice. It was a land that did not want people in it, a place that would kill you as soon as look at you. And somewhere out in the middle of this emptiness was the man she was being forced to marry. When they finally saw the cabin, it was little more than a dark smudge against the snow-dusted ground. As they drew closer, it resolved into a structure of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud, with a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke into the air. It stood utterly alone, without a barn or proper fences, looking less like a home and more like a wound on the face of the earth, a lonely scar. A man was standing outside, waiting for them. He was chopping wood, the rhythmic chunk of his axe the only sound in the vast stillness. He stopped as the wagon creaked to a halt, resting the axe head on the chopping block. It was him, Luke Hardin. He was just as the rumors described, and yet, somehow worse. He was tall and broad-shouldered, built with the hard, lean muscle of a man who worked from sunup to sundown. His face was weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of a hard life. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, distant gray, the color of the winter sky, and they looked at her without curiosity, without welcome, without anything at all. They were the eyes of a man haunted by some profound and unending loss. He did not smile. Thomas Carter climbed down from the wagon, his movements stiff and uncertain. "Hardin," he said, his voice thin, I've brought her." Luke Hardin's gaze shifted from Ellie to her father, and for a fleeting moment, something that looked like contempt flickered in their depths. He gave a curt nod, his silence more powerful than any words. He walked over to the wagon and looked up at Ellie. She flinched, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders. He simply reached up a hand to help her down. His hand was large, calloused, and surprisingly steady. She hesitated for a second before placing her small, gloved hand in his. His grip was firm, impersonal. He helped her to the ground, and their hands parted as quickly as they had met. The preacher was already there, a nervous little man named Reverend Miller, his Bible clutched in his hands as if for protection. A few men from the town had ridden out as well, their face grim and curious. They were the official witnesses to the transaction. There was no church, no music, no flowers. The wedding was performed right there, in the biting wind, with the desolate plains as their cathedral and the whispering onlookers as their congregation. Reverend Miller's voice trembled as he rushed through the words, the phrases about love and honor sounding like a mockery in the frozen air. Ellie stood numbly, her gaze fixed on a crack in the frozen mud at her feet. She felt Luke Hardin's presence beside her, a wall of warmth and silence. When it came time for the ring, he produced a simple, unadorned band of gold. It looked old. He took her left hand, and his rough, powerful fingers fumbled for a moment with hers. Her hand trembled violently, uncontrollably. His touch was not cruel, but it was devoid of any tenderness. It was the touch of a man shoeing a horse. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was cold against her skin. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher finished, his relief palpable. The small crowd of witnesses murmured amongst themselves. Ellie could feel their eyes on her, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She was no longer Eleanor Carter. She was Mrs. Harden, the property of a silent, violent man. Her father, unable to look at her, climbed back into his wagon, gave a weak flick of the reins, and rode away without a backward glance, leaving her alone with her new husband. The first night in the cabin was an exercise in quiet terror. The interior was as stark and unwelcoming as the man who inhabited it. It was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A narrow bed, covered with a pile of furs, was pushed against one wall. The air smelled of pine, old smoke, and something else, an undercurrent of loneliness so profound it felt like a physical presence. Luke brought her belongings in, a small trunk her father had packed for her, and set it by the foot of the bed. He did not speak to her. He moved about the cabin with an economy of motion, stoking the fire, checking the latch on the door. He was a creature of silence. When it was time to sleep, a fresh wave of fear washed over Ellie. He was her husband. He had rights. She stood frozen, her back to him, waiting for his touch, for the consummation of the horrifying bargain. But it never came. She heard the scrape of a chair and turned to see him pulling a thick buffalo hide from a peg on the wall. He laid it on the floor in front of the hearth, a good 10 feet from the bed. He then unbuckled his gun belt, the leather sighing in the quiet room, and laid it on the floor beside the hide, his pistol within easy reach. He took off his boots, but nothing else, and lay down with his back to her, pulling a coarse wool blanket over himself. "The bed is yours," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be dragged from deep within his chest. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her since she arrived. Ellie stood there for a long time, listening to the crackle of the fire and the sound of his steady breathing. Outside, the wind howled, and in the distance, she heard the lonely, chilling cry of a wolf, answered by another. She finally crept to the bed and slid beneath the heavy furs, still fully dressed. She lay awake for hours, rigid with fear and confusion, her eyes wide open in the flickering darkness. She listened to the wolves, and the wind, and the quiet breathing of the strange, dangerous man she had married, and wondered what his nightmares were about. The days that followed fell into a harsh, monotonous rhythm. The world was shades of gray and white, a landscape of endless winter. The silence between them was a third entity in the small cabin, a living thing that grew heavier with each passing hour. Luke was a tireless worker. He rose before dawn, tended to his horse, and spent his days hunting or cutting firewood, his axe a steady, percussive beat against the vast quiet. He provided for her, as a husband was supposed to. There was always fresh meat, venison or rabbit, and a seemingly endless supply of firewood to keep the cabin from freezing. He was a shield against the brutality of the wilderness. He protected her from the cold and from starvation, but he offered no warmth himself. He spoke only when necessary, in single words or short, clipped phrases. "More wood. Storm's coming. Eat." They took their meals in silence at the rough table. Ellie would watch him from across the small space, studying the hard lines of his face, the way his eyes never seemed to settle on anything inside the cabin, always looking past her, toward the window, toward the bleak horizon. She learned the landscape of his face before she ever learned the sound of his voice in conversation. She knew the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the permanent squint of his eyes from years of staring into the sun, the tense set of his jaw that never seemed to relax, even when he was still. Her loneliness became a physical ache, a gnawing emptiness in the pit of her stomach that no amount of food could fill. She was more isolated than she had ever been in her life, a prisoner in a cage of silence and snow. The days bled into one another, indistinguishable and bleak. The Bible on her bedside table remained her only solace, its psalms of hope and deliverance a stark contrast to the reality of her life. One morning, the weight of it all became too much to bear. The sky was a low, oppressive gray, and the silence in the cabin felt like it was crushing her lungs. Luke had gone out early to check his trap lines. An impulse, born of pure desperation, seized her. She could not endure another day, another hour of this half-life. Without stopping to think, she pulled on her coat, wrapped her mother's shawl tightly around her head and shoulders, and slipped out the door. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she had to leave. She ran, stumbling through the deep snow, her only thought to put as much distance as possible between herself and that silent, lonely cabin. The wind was a fury, whipping snow into her face, blinding her. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of swirling white. She quickly lost her sense of direction, every landmark erased by the blizzard. The cold began to seep into her bones, a deep and deadly chill. Her lungs burned with every ragged breath. Panic gave way to a weary numbness. She fell, picked herself up, and fell again. Finally, she could go no further. She curled into a small ball at the base of a frozen tree, the world fading to black around her as the snow began to gently bury her. She woke to warmth, a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to be radiating through her right hand. Her mind was foggy, her body heavy and aching. She slowly opened her eyes. She was in the cabin, lying in the bed, buried under a mountain of furs. The fire was roaring in the hearth, casting a warm, orange glow over the room. And Luke was sitting on the edge of the bed beside her. He was leaning forward, his shoulders slumped with what looked like exhaustion, and he was holding her hand. His large, calloused hand was wrapped completely around her smaller one, his thumb gently rubbing circles on her frozen skin, coaxing the life back into it. His touch was firm, steady, and overwhelmingly warm. She stared at their joined hands, a wave of profound confusion washing over her. This was a gesture of such simple, wordless intimacy that it did not fit with the man she knew. This was not the act of a cold, indifferent captor. It was an act of care. He must have felt her stir, because he looked up. Their eyes met for a long, silent moment. She saw something in his gaze she had never seen before, not the haunted distance, but a flicker of raw, unguarded concern. As soon as he saw she was awake, he dropped her hand as if it had burned him. He stood up abruptly, his face closing off again, the familiar mask of stoicism falling back into place. "You were a fool to run," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Another hour and you would have been dead." He turned and walked over to the fire, busying himself with the poker, his back to her. The moment of connection, as fragile and fleeting as a snowflake, was gone. But it had happened. She had felt the warmth of his hand, seen the worry in his eyes, and that small, confusing memory was enough to plant a tiny seed of doubt in the frozen soil of her fear. In the days that followed, Ellie began to watch him differently. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. But now it was joined by a cautious curiosity. She started to see things she had missed before, small cracks in the fortress of his silence. His horse, a big roan gelding, had picked up a stone and bruised its hoof. Ellie watched from the cabin doorway as Luke spent the better part of an afternoon tending to the animal. He spoke to the horse in a low, soothing murmur, his hands gentle as he cleaned the wound and wrapped it in a clean cloth. It was a tenderness he never showed to her, a softness reserved for a creature that could not judge or misunderstand him. A week later, they had to ride into Redemption Gulch for supplies. The journey was as silent as always, but being out of the cabin, seeing other people, was a relief. At the general store, a place buzzing with gossip and scrutiny, Ellie felt the weight of the town's judgment. People stared. They whispered behind their hands. She was the girl who had been sold to the killer. While Luke was negotiating with the storekeeper over the price of flour, Ellie saw Mrs. Gable, a poor widow with too many children and not enough luck. She was trying to buy medicine for her youngest, who was sick with a fever, but she was a few cents short. The storekeeper, a man known for his tight fists, was shaking his head, preparing to send her away empty-handed. Ellie watched, her heart aching for the woman. When Luke stepped forward, he did not say a word. He simply placed a silver dollar on the counter, far more than what was needed, and gave the storekeeper a look so cold and hard that the man flinched. He then turned and walked away, acting as if he had done nothing at all. He never looked at the widow, never acknowledged her stammered, tearful thanks, but he had seen her need, and he had acted. It was a quiet, almost invisible act of justice. On the ride back to the homestead, the silence felt different. It was still vast and deep, but it no longer felt entirely empty. Ellie glanced at the man riding beside her. His face was set in the same hard lines, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He was still a mystery, a man locked away inside his own grief. She was still his prisoner, bound to him by a heartless bargain. But he had carried her from a blizzard. He had held her hand to warm her. He had shown kindness to a suffering animal and defended a helpless widow. Fear still lingered, a cold shadow in her heart. But now, another feeling was stirring beside it, something fragile and uncertain. It was a question. Who was Luke Hardin? And was the man she was beginning to see the same man the rest of the world feared? She did not have the answers, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of desire to find them. The fragile truce Ellie had forged with her fear was shattered on a trip to town 2 weeks later. The winter had finally broken, leaving the world a muddy, sodden brown, and the track into Redemption Gulch was a treacherous mire. Luke had needed to purchase seed for a small spring planting, a hopeful gesture that had felt to Ellie like a promise of a future. While he conducted his business in the feed store, she had waited on the buckboard, breathing in the unfamiliar sense of society, coal smoke, baking bread, and manure. 2 old trappers were hunkered down on the bench outside the saloon, their voices a low, gravelly murmur carried on the damp air. She was not trying to listen, but then she heard Luke's name, and she could not help but freeze. "Hardin bought seed," one of them rasped, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near his boot. "Heard tell he's planting corn, taming himself, maybe." The other man gave a short, cynical laugh. "A wolf's a wolf, even if it learns to sit. You cannot tame the likes of him, not after what happened with that girl." "Clara," the first man said, the name dropping like a stone into the conversation. "Pretty little thing, sang like a meadowlark, had every man in the territory sniffing around her, but she only had eyes for Hardin. And look where it got her," the second man said, his voice dropping lower. "And where it got Jebediah Stokes. 6 feet under, that's where Hardin put him there himself, right after the fire that took the old saloon. They say Jebediah started the blaze to get at her. Hardin found them in the smoke. Jebediah ended up with a bullet in his chest. And that girl, Clara, she just vanished, plucked right off the earth. Most folks reckon Hardin buried them both in the same hole." Ellie's blood ran cold. The men's words painted a picture of fire and jealousy and death. A saloon girl named Clara, a man killed, and her husband at the center of it all. A specter of violence emerging from the smoke. The glimpses of decency she had seen in him, his quiet acts of kindness, were suddenly thrown into a sinister new light. Was his gentleness with the horse a penance? Was his defense of the widow a performance? The fear she had been trying to suppress came roaring back, more potent than ever, because now it had a name. Clara. The ride home was a return to the familiar, suffocating silence. But this time it was charged with Ellie's terror. She kept stealing glances at him, at his strong hands on the reins, the same hands that had held hers to warm them, the same hands that had, perhaps, pulled a trigger and ended a man's life. Every line on his face now seemed to be a map of his violent past. She wanted to ask him. The question burned on her tongue. Is it true? Did you kill a man over a woman? What happened to her? But she could not. To speak the name Clara aloud felt like it would unleash some terrible force, a truth she was not ready to face. And so she said nothing, and the silence festered. Luke seemed to sense the change in her. He withdrew even further into himself, the wall around him growing higher and thicker. He threw himself into his work with a frantic energy, as if he could outrun the ghosts that chased him. He spent his days from dawn until dusk rebuilding the dilapidated fences around the property, his hammer blows ringing out a furious, desperate rhythm. He felled trees with a frightening intensity, his axe swinging in powerful, clean arcs, sweat soaking his shirt even in the cool spring air. He was a man at war with his own memories. At night, he began to drink. He would sit by the fire after their silent supper, a bottle of whiskey at his elbow, and stare into the flames. He would not get drunk in a loud or boisterous way. His drinking was as silent and grim as everything else he did. It was a methodical effort to dull something inside him, to quiet the voices that only he could hear. And the nightmares grew worse. Ellie would lie in her bed, pretending to be asleep, and listen to him thrashing on his pallet by the fire. He would mutter in his sleep, broken words and guttural groans of anguish. One night, she heard him cry out a name, a strangled, agonized sound that ripped through the quiet cabin and pierced her heart. Clara! The sound of it, from his own lips, was a confirmation of her worst fears. He was not just a killer. He was a man haunted by a dead woman's ghost. Her fear for her own safety was now tangled with a strange, unwelcome pang of pity for him. She was trapped with a man who was himself trapped in a prison of his own making, desperate for some way to push back against the oppressive gloom. Ellie began to tend to the cabin. It was the only thing she felt she could control. If she could not bring light into the man, perhaps she could bring it into his house. She started with the grime. She scrubbed the floors with lye soap and water until the wood planks were pale and clean. She washed the single, grimy window until the weak spring sunlight could finally stream through, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She took down the tattered burlap sacks he had nailed over the window frame and mended them with careful, tiny stitches. She organized the sparse shelves, stacking the tins of beans and sacks of flour in neat rows. She found a stash of old rags and tore them into strips, braiding them into a small, colorful rug to place by the hearth. Her work was a silent rebellion against the bleakness. Every clean surface, every small act of order, was a prayer for peace. One afternoon, while walking along the creek bed that bordered the property, she found a patch of early wildflowers, stubborn little blossoms of purple and yellow pushing their way through the hard soil. She gathered a small bouquet and carried them back to the cabin. She had no vase, so she washed out an empty bean tin and placed the flowers in it on the center of the table. When Luke came in for supper that evening, he stopped dead in the doorway. His eyes swept over the room, taking in the clean floors, the brighter window, the small rug. He did not say anything, but his gaze finally settled on the splash of color on the table. He stared at the wildflowers for a long moment, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. He then moved to the table and sat down to eat, as silent as ever. But throughout the meal, his eyes kept drifting back to the flowers, as if he were looking at something he had not seen in a very long time. Slowly, painstakingly, with her small, quiet acts of care. Ellie was turning his shelter into a home. One day in late spring, a visitor arrived. He was a traveling preacher, a thin, wiry man with a kind face and clothes dusty from the road. He introduced himself as Reverend Stone, and he had a gentle way about him that immediately put Ellie at ease. Luke was wary, as he was with all strangers, but he offered the man a dipper of water and a place to rest by the fire. the unwritten code of hospitality on the frontier overriding his natural reclusiveness. The preacher's eyes kept coming back to Ellie. "Forgive me, ma'am," he said, his voice soft. "But I know your face. You are Thomas Carter's girl, are you not? From Redemption Gulch." Ellie's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, sir, I am." The preacher's face clouded with sympathy. He looked from Ellie to Luke and back again. "Then I am the unfortunate bearer of sad tidings. I am truly sorry to be the one to tell you this. Child, your father, he has passed on." The words did not seem real. Ellie stared at him, her mind refusing to process the information. "Passed on? What? How?" "It was about a month ago. Now," the preacher said gently, "the thaw came, and they found him near the edge of town. It seems he had another run of bad luck at the tables. He wandered out into the cold. The whiskey and the grief were a bad combination. I'm afraid the Lord has called him home." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Her father was dead, found frozen, just as she had almost been. He had gone back to the very vice that had led to her ruin, and it had killed him. A wave of grief, so powerful and overwhelming it stole the breath from her lungs, crashed over her. It was not just grief for his death, but for the broken man he had become, for the fact that he had sold her and then died alone in the cold, a final, pathetic victim of his own weakness. A sob tore itself from her throat, a raw, animal sound of pain. She covered her face with her hands, and her body began to shake with uncontrollable sobs. She sank to her knees, the weight of it all too much to bear. And then she felt a presence behind her. Strong hands settled on her shoulders. She looked up through her tears to see Luke kneeling beside her. His face was a mask of grim concern. He did not speak. He did not know the words. Instead, he did the only thing he could. He reached out and pulled her into his arms. His embrace was clumsy, hesitant, the embrace of a man for whom tenderness was a foreign language. His arms were like steel bands around her, but they were not crushing her. They were holding her together. She buried her face in the rough wool of his shirt, and she wept. She cried for her dead father, for her lost mother, for the life she would never have, for the fear and loneliness that had been her constant companions. And he just held her. He did not pat her back or offer empty platitudes. He simply provided his solid, unwavering presence, a silent anchor in her storm of grief. He absorbed her tears and her pain into himself, and for the first time since she had arrived at this desolate place, she did not feel alone. In the midst of her heartbreak, she saw through the rumors, past the violence and the silence, and for the first time, she saw the man. She saw his humanity, and it was clumsy, but it was real. That night, the preacher slept in the cabin, his quiet prayers a soft murmur in the darkness. The next morning, he thanked them for their hospitality, gave Ellie a final, pitying look, and rode on his way, leaving the two of them alone once more. The air in the cabin had changed. The shared moment of grief had broken something open between them. That evening, a storm rolled in, the wind howling around the eaves of the cabin like a hungry animal, and the rain lashing against the window pane. Ellie sat by the fire, wrapped in her mother's shawl, staring into the flames. She felt hollowed out, empty. Luke had been outside, securing the horse. The door opened, and he came in, bringing a gust of wind and rain with him. He was soaked, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, water dripping from his jaw. He shut the door, plunging the room back into a warm, fire-lit silence. He stood there for a moment, just looking at her. "I am sorry," he said, his voice low and rough. She looked up at him, confused. "For what?" "For all of it," he said, and the words seemed to be torn from him, raw and painful. Not for marrying you, but for everything else. For the fear, for the silence, for this life I dragged you into." It was the closest he had ever come to an explanation, to an apology for the man he was. His vulnerability was a door left ajar. and she found the courage to step through it. She looked at him, her own grief making her bold. "Do you regret it, Luke?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Marrying me?" He walked over to the fire and stood beside her, looking down into the flames. The firelight carved deep shadows onto his face. He was quiet for so long that she thought he would not answer. Then he spoke, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it over the howling wind. "Every day," he said softly, "and yet not a single one." The words hung in the air between them, a perfect, heartbreaking contradiction. He regretted the pain he caused her, the circumstances that bound them, the darkness he could not escape, but he did not regret her. In that moment, something shifted. A spark, long dormant, finally caught fire in the space between them. It was a connection forged not of a preacher's words or a legal document, but of shared pain and a fragile, emerging truth. It was hesitant, tentative, but it was filled with all the unspoken desire and longing that had been building in the silence for months. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and pine. The silence at breakfast was different. It was no longer heavy and oppressive, but filled with an unspoken awareness, a quiet tension that was both frightening and exhilarating. After they had eaten, Luke went to a small wooden chest in the corner of the room, one Ellie had never seen him open. He knelt before it and pulled out something small, which he held concealed in his fist. He walked over to where she stood by the table and paused in front of her. He opened his hand. Lying on his calloused palm was a small, silver locket, tarnished with age, hanging from a delicate chain. It was oval-shaped, with intricate engravings of vines and leaves on its surface. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice gruff, as if he were embarrassed by the sentiment. He did not look at her, but instead focused on the locket in his hand. "She would have wanted you to have it." He held it out to her. Ellie reached out a trembling hand and took it. The metal was cool against her skin. It was a beautiful, intimate thing, a piece of his history, a link to a past before the silence and the sorrow. It was a gesture of protection, an offering of trust, though he could not say the words aloud. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She fumbled with the clasp, and he reached out, his fingers brushing hers as he took the locket and fastened it around her neck. His touch was brief, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her. She looked down at the locket resting against her chest. I have nothing to give you in return." He finally raised his eyes to meet hers. For the first time, the haunted distance was gone, replaced by an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "You do not owe me anything, Ellie," he said quietly. But she knew he meant more. He was not just talking about the locket. He was talking about the bargain, about her father's debt, about the way she had come to him. He was trying, in his own silent, broken way, to set her free. He was telling her that whatever happened between them now would not be a payment. It would be a choice. And in the quiet of the cabin, with the morning sun streaming through the clean window, Ellie felt the first terrifying flicker of what that choice might be. Spring arrived on the plains not as a gentle guest, but as a raw and muddy force of nature. The snow retreated, leaving the ground saturated and soft, and the creek swelled into a rushing brown torrent. Green shoots, determined and fragile, pushed their way through the earth, and the air, for the first time in months, lost its bitter edge. The new life brought with it a sense of hope, a feeling that things could grow and change. But with the thaw came new troubles. The open land, once locked in ice, became a highway for desperate men. Rumors began to trickle in from the distant homesteads, carried by the wind itself. A family to the south had lost their livestock. A supply wagon on the trail from Redemption Gulch had been hit, the driver left for dead. A band of outlaws, driven by hunger and a cruel opportunism, was moving through the territory, preying on the isolated and the vulnerable. The fear in the air was a palpable thing, a low hum of anxiety that settled over the land. Luke grew even more watchful, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his rifle never far from his hand. The fragile peace they had begun to build was now threatened by a danger from without, a danger that made their isolation feel less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. The last of their salt was gone, and their supply of flour was dangerously low. A trip to town was unavoidable. When Luke announced one morning that he would be riding to Redemption Gulch, his tone left no room for discussion. It was a statement of fact. "I am coming with you," Ellie said. It was not a question. Her voice was quiet, but firm. He stopped in the act of pulling on his boots and looked at her. "No, it is not safe. You will stay here." "It is not safe here either," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "I will not be left alone to wait and worry, and I will not hide. I am your wife. I will ride with you." He saw the new strength in her, the resolve that had been forged in grief and loneliness. This was not the terrified girl who had arrived in a wagon months ago. This was a woman who was claiming her place in the world, however small and dangerous that world might be. A muscle worked in his jaw. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the venom of the town and the dangers of the trail. But he also saw that to deny her, this was to treat her as a prisoner again, to undermine the very strength he was beginning to admire. He gave a single, curt nod. "Be ready in 5 minutes." The town felt different under the spring sun. The mud in the main street was thick, and the air was alive with the sounds of commerce and conversation. But as they rode in on the buckboard, a familiar chill fell over Ellie. A silence followed them, rippling outwards from their position. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The whispers began. A sibilant hiss that followed them like a swarm of insects. They were a spectacle, the killer and his purchased bride. Luke seemed not to notice, his face an unreadable mask as he tied the horse to the hitching post in front of the general store. But Ellie felt every stare, every scornful glance, like a physical blow. She held her head high, the silver locket he had given her resting against her throat. A cool, secret comfort. Inside the store, the hostility was thicker. Mrs. Pringle, the storekeeper's wife and the town's self-appointed moral authority, was holding court near the fabric bolts. She saw them enter, and her lips pinched into a thin line of disapproval. As Ellie passed, the woman spoke to her companions, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "It is a sin and a shame," she declared, not looking at Ellie but making sure she could hear. "That poor girl, her father not even cold in the ground, shackled to a man like that. A man with blood on his hands. It is no wonder she looks so pale, living in fear, I imagine." The words were meant to wound, to isolate her with pity and scorn. The old Ellie would have shrunk away, her face burning with shame, but something inside her snapped. She had endured too much, her father's weakness, the crushing loneliness, the terror of the blizzard, the specter of a ghost named Clara, to be broken now by the petty cruelty of a town gossip. She stopped and turned. The store fell silent. Every eye was on her. Luke, who had been at the counter, turned slowly, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip, his face dark with a gathering storm. Ellie looked directly at Mrs. Pringle. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her voice, when it came, was as clear and steady as a church bell. "My husband is a good man," she said, her words dropping into the silence like stones into a still pond. "He provides for me and he protects me. You speak of things you know nothing about." She took a step closer, her gaze never leaving the woman's shocked face. "I am not afraid. You should spend more time tending to your own soul and less time judging mine." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Mrs. Pringle's face turned a blotchy red, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on a line, no sound coming out. Ellie held her gaze for another moment, then turned her back on the woman and walked to the counter to stand beside Luke. She could feel him looking at her, and she risked a glance up at his face. The anger was gone. In its place was an expression of profound, utter shock. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of the old pain, the deep-seated belief that he did not deserve her defense. But she also saw something new. It was a flicker of awe, of wonder. For the first time since his past had shattered around him, someone had stood up and willingly taken his side. Her defiance had not only silenced the town, it had awakened something in him. They finished their business in a stunned silence and left the store. The ride back was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not empty. It was charged, humming with the unspoken aftermath of what had happened. Halfway home, Luke pulled the horse to a stop by the river to let it drink. The water, swollen with melted snow, rushed over the rocks, the sound a steady roar. He dismounted and stood looking at the current, his back to her. Ellie slid down from the buckboard and walked to stand a few feet away from him. The silence stretched on, filled only by the sound of the river. She knew he was wrestling with a storm of emotions he had no words for. It was up to her to bridge the distance between them. "Luke," she said softly. He did not turn, but she knew he was listening. "I meant what I said," she continued, her own words giving her strength. "In the store." She waited a beat, then took a deep breath. "I do not want to be afraid anymore. Not of them, and not of you." At this, he finally turned to look at her. His face was a study in conflict. His gray eyes, usually so distant, were fixed on her with a raw intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He looked at her as if she were a puzzle he could not solve, a miracle he could not comprehend. He saw the woman who had tended his horse, who had brought flowers into his home, who had wept in his arms, and who had just faced down a town for his sake. He saw her strength, her courage, and her compassion, and he knew, with a certainty that was both a comfort and a terror, that she was beginning to see the man buried beneath the monster. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. He just stood there, looking at her, his silence a testament to the depth of the emotion that held him captive. Then he turned, checked the horse, and helped her back onto the buckboard, his touch lingering on her hand for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. A week later, the bandits came. They came in the dead of night, under the sliver of a crescent moon. Ellie was woken from a light sleep by the sound of a twig snapping just outside the cabin. It was a small sound, one that could have been an animal, but it was followed by an unnatural silence. The usual chorus of crickets had stopped. She sat up in bed, her heart beginning to pound. Across the room, Luke was already moving. He had risen from his pallet by the fire with the silent grace of a predator, the rifle he always kept beside him already in his hands. He motioned for her to stay down, his eyes fixed on the cabin door. Then came the splintering crash as a heavy boot slammed against the wood. The door shuddered on its hinges. Another crash, and the latch broke. The door swung open, and 3 figures, silhouetted against the faint moonlight, spilled into the room. Everything happened in a blur of motion and terrifying sound. One of the men lunged forward, a knife gleaming in his hand. Luke did not hesitate. The rifle roared in the confines of the small cabin. The sound, a deafening explosion of violence. The man with the knife was thrown backwards out the door. A strangled cry cut short. The other 2 men, momentarily stunned, recovered and charged. Luke did not have time to reload. He used the rifle like a club, swinging the heavy stock in a brutal arc that connected with one man's head with a sickening crack. The man dropped to the floor like a sack of grain. The 3rd bandit was on him, a big bearded man with desperation in his eyes. He grappled with Luke, and the 2 of them crashed against the table, sending the tin of wildflowers scattering across the floor. They were a tangle of limbs and fury. Ellie, huddled on the bed, could only watch in terror as the 2 men fought. She saw the glint of another knife. She heard a sharp cry of pain from Luke. Then, with a final, desperate surge of strength, Luke threw the man off him. He drew the pistol from his belt in a single, fluid motion. The bandit scrambled to his feet and fled into the darkness, disappearing after his accomplice. The silence that descended was more shocking than the noise. It was absolute, broken only by the sound of Luke's harsh, ragged breathing. He stood in the middle of the room, pistol still raised, his body tense. The man on the floor groaned once, then was still. Slowly, Luke lowered the gun. He turned to look at Ellie, his face a grim shadow in the moonlight. "Are you hurt?" he rasped, his voice rough. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you?" He did not answer. He swayed on his feet and leaned a hand against the wall to steady himself. It was then that she saw the dark stain spreading across the sleeve of his left arm. The fear that had paralyzed her broke, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. She scrambled off the bed and rushed to his side. "You are bleeding." "It is just a scratch," he grunted. But she could see the pain in his eyes, the way his face was unnaturally pale beneath its tan. "Sit," she commanded, her voice surprisingly firm. She pushed a chair towards him, and he sank into it, his body slumping with exhaustion and pain. She lit a lantern, her hands shaking so badly it took her 3 tries. The warm light filled the cabin, revealing the chaos of the fight. The overturned furniture, the dead man on the floor, the scattered flowers, and the blood, so much blood, dripping from Luke's arm onto the clean floorboards. She pushed aside her fear and revulsion. He needed her. She fetched the whiskey bottle, a roll of clean linen she had been saving for bandages, and a basin of water. As she knelt before him, she saw that the cut was deep, a long, ugly gash from his shoulder to his elbow where the bandit's knife had sliced through his shirt and into the muscle beneath. "This will sting," she said, her voice softer now. She uncorked the whiskey and poured a generous amount onto a cloth. He just nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes watching her. As she began to clean the wound, her hands trembled, but her eyes were steady on her task. She worked with a focused intensity, her touch surprisingly gentle as she cleaned away the blood and grime. He did not flinch, did not make a sound, but she could feel the tension in his body, the tight control he was exerting over his pain. When the wound was clean, she bandaged it tightly, her small hands moving with a new and unfamiliar confidence. When she was finished, she remained kneeling before him, her hands resting on his knee. The silence returned, thick with unspoken emotions. The adrenaline from the fight was fading, leaving in its wake a raw and powerful awareness of each other. They were alive. They had survived. He reached out his good hand and cupped her jaw, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. His touch was hesitant, questioning. She leaned into his hand, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment. All the barriers between them, the fear, the secrets, the silence, seemed to have been burned away in the violence of the night, leaving only this raw, undeniable connection. He looked down at her, his gray eyes dark with an emotion she could not name. It was a maelstrom of longing and pain and a desperate, fragile hope. She raised her own hand to cover his, her gaze meeting his without fear. And then he leaned down, and she rose up to meet him, and their lips met. The kiss was not gentle, it was fierce, born of terror and relief, a desperate affirmation of life in the face of death. It was a raw outpouring of all the unspoken words, all the stolen glances, all the pent-up loneliness and longing of the past months. It was the taste of whiskey and blood and something akin to salvation. Then, the kiss softened, becoming something else entirely. It became tender, searching, a quiet conversation in the language of touch. It was a kiss that sealed a pact made in a moment of shared defiance in town and consecrated in a moment of shared survival in the cabin. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. In that moment, in the quiet aftermath of violence. With a dead man lying on their floor, Ellie felt a profound and unwavering sense of peace. She was home. The next morning, the world felt both new and painfully familiar. Luke had dealt with the bodies before dawn, his movements efficient and grim, erasing the evidence of the night's violence. But he could not erase the change between them. Ellie awoke in her own bed, but the memory of the kiss, of the feel of his lips on hers, was as vivid as if it had just happened. A fragile hope bloomed in her chest. She had thought, prayed, that the night of terror had finally broken down the last of his walls. But when she emerged into the main room, he was distant again. The openness she had seen in his eyes the night before was gone, replaced by the familiar, haunted shadows. He sat at the table, cleaning his pistol, his movements precise and mechanical. His face was a closed door. The silence was back, but this time it was worse than before. It was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of a door being deliberately shut in her face. He was shrouded in guilt. She could see it in the tense set of his shoulders, in the way he would not meet her eyes. He had allowed himself a moment of connection, a moment of tenderness, and now his own demons were punishing him for it. He had brought violence to her doorstep, had bled on her floor, and had sealed his trespass with a kiss. In his mind, he had tainted her, irrevocably drawing her into the darkness that defined his life. Ellie felt a sharp, piercing pain that was worse than any fear she had ever known. It was the pain of being loved and yet kept at arm's length, of being given a glimpse of a promised land only to have the gate slammed shut. She had fought for him, tended to him, and given him her heart in a single, desperate kiss, and he had retreated back into his prison of secrets. She looked at him across the small room, at this good and broken man, and a new question began to form in her mind, a question that was colder and more frightening than any bandit's knife. What truly haunted him? What secret was so terrible that he felt he did not deserve a moment of happiness, a flicker of love? She had survived the winter, and the blizzard, and the town's scorn, and the outlaws' attack. But she began to wonder, with a dawning sense of dread, if their fledgling love could survive the ghosts of his past. The uneasy peace that had settled over the homestead was as fragile as a spider's web, beautiful in the morning light but easily torn. Luke had retreated behind his wall of silence after their kiss. But the nature of that silence had changed. It was no longer a barrier of indifference, but one of profound, painful guilt. He worked beside Ellie, their hands sometimes brushing, their eyes sometimes meeting, and in those moments, a current of unspoken longing would pass between them, but he would always be the first to look away, his face hardening as he retreated back into the prison of his past. One sweltering afternoon in early summer, the past came riding in on a tired-looking horse. A man appeared on the horizon, a lone figure moving with a grim purpose across the heat-shimmering plains. As he drew closer, Ellie felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. He was not a lost traveler or a wandering preacher. There was an air of focused malevolence about him, a wiry tension in the way he sat his saddle. Luke saw him too. He stopped his work mending a harness and stood motionless, his hand dropping instinctively to the pistol at his hip. He watched the rider approach, his face carved from stone. The man reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin. He was thin, with a face burned dark by the sun and eyes that glittered with a feverish light. They were the eyes of a zealot, consumed by a single, burning purpose. He dismounted, his movements jerky and agitated. "Luke Harden," the man said, his voice a dry rasp. He ignored Ellie completely. "You have business with me." Luke's voice was low and cold, a warning rumble. "I do," the man said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "My name is Caleb Stokes. My brother was Jebediah Stokes, a name I am sure you have not forgotten." The air grew thick and heavy. So this was it. The ghost had a name, and now it had a family. Ellie felt the blood drain from her face. I remember him, Luke said, his voice flat. Good, Caleb spat. Then you remember that you shot him down in cold blood. You murdered him and stole the woman he was set to marry. My brother's spirit will not rest until his blood is avenged. I am here to give him that peace. He patted the gun holstered on his own hip. I am calling you out, Hardin, right here, right now. Ellie looked at Luke, expecting to see the flicker of violence, the cold fire she knew he was capable of. But his face was filled with a profound weariness. He looked not at Caleb, but past him, at the vast, empty plains, as if he were seeing a line of graves stretching to the horizon. I am done with fighting, Luke said, his voice heavy with finality. I will not draw on you. Stokes, say what you came to say and then ride on. Caleb's face contorted with fury. He had come for a showdown, for a legendary confrontation with the man who had ruined his family. This quiet refusal was an insult he could not stomach. A coward, then, just like they say, you have grown soft out here with your bought wife. You hide behind her skirts. Luke's jaw tightened, but he did not rise to the bait. He stood his ground, a pillar of immovable resolve. He would not kill again. Caleb, seeing that insults would not work, let his venomous gaze slide over to Ellie. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. A fine-looking woman, he said, his voice taking on a slimy, suggestive tone. A shame to make a widow of her. Then again, maybe I will not. Perhaps after I'm done with you, I will stay a while. Keep her company. I'm sure she gets lonely out here. That was the line. A visible change came over Luke. The weariness in his eyes was replaced by a deadly calm, a cold, focused light that was more terrifying than any rage. He had refused to fight for his own life, but he would not allow a threat to touch hers. You will not lay a hand on her, Luke said, each word a chip of ice. Then face me, Caleb challenged, his eyes gleaming with triumph. Or I swear on my brother's grave, I will come back for her when you least expect it. Luke looked at Ellie. He saw the terror in her eyes, and he knew he had no choice. He had tried to outrun his past, but it had found him, and now it was threatening the only good thing in his life. He had to face it, not with the violence of his old life, but on his own terms. Dawn, Luke said, his voice flat. At the river crossing, just you and me. Caleb smiled, a predator's grin. Dawn it is. He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and hatred hanging in the air. The rest of the day passed in a haze of dreamlike tension. They did not speak of what was to come. They ate their supper in silence, the unspoken fear a chasm between them. That night, Ellie lay awake in her bed, listening to the sounds of Luke cleaning his pistol by the faint light of the fire. The soft clicks and scrapes of metal on metal were the sounds of a death being prepared. Before the first hint of gray touched the eastern sky, he was up. He moved with a quiet purpose, pulling on his boots, buckling his gun belt. Ellie rose and dressed in the dark. You should stay here, he said, not looking at her. No, she replied, her voice steady. I am coming with you. He finally turned to her, his face a mask in the pre-dawn gloom. He saw her resolve, the same unyielding strength she had shown in the general store, and he did not argue. They rode to the river crossing in silence, the air cool and damp against their skin. Caleb was already there, a taut, nervous silhouette against the brightening sky. The world seemed to be holding its breath. The only sound was the rush of the river and the lonely cry of a hawk circling high above. There were no seconds, no formalities. This was not a gentleman's duel. It was a raw act of frontier vengeance. I am ready when you are, murderer, Caleb snarled. Luke dismounted and handed his horse's reins to Ellie. He walked to the center of the clearing, his movements deliberate, his body relaxed. He faced Caleb, who stood about 20 paces away. his hand hovering over the butt of his pistol. "This ends today, Stokes," Luke said, his voice calm and clear, "one way or another." Ellie watched, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. This was the moment she had feared, the moment the rumors became real. She was about to watch the man she loved become a killer again. Caleb's hand moved, a blur of motion as he drew his gun. But Luke was faster. His draw was not just fast, it was a thing of impossible, fluid grace, a movement so practiced it seemed a part of him. The gun was in his hand, leveled and steady. Before Caleb's had even cleared its holster, a single shot cracked through the morning stillness. It was not the sound of a killing shot. Instead of seeing Caleb fall, Ellie saw the gun fly from his hand, spinning through the air before landing in the dirt. Caleb stared at his hand, a dark line of blood welling up where the bullet had grazed his knuckles, his face a mask of disbelief and shock. He was disarmed, defeated, utterly humiliated. Luke stood there for a long moment, the smoke curling from the barrel of his pistol. He could have killed him. He could have ended it, but he did not. He lowered the gun, turned his back on the trembling, defeated man, and walked away. He walked back to Ellie, his face calm. As he reached her, he looked into her eyes, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw a flicker of genuine peace in their depths. It was the quiet peace of a man who had finally faced the ghosts of his past and chosen mercy. A man who had broken a long and terrible cycle of violence. News of the duel spread through Redemption Gulch like a prairie fire, but the story the town told was not one of mercy. They saw Luke's actions not as strength, but as weakness. The legendary gunfighter, Luke Harden, had lost his nerve. He had faced down his rival and let him walk away. The whispers and suspicion that had followed him for years intensified. He was no longer just feared. He was now an object of scorn, a man whose reputation was unraveling. The town's judgment, however, had the opposite effect on Ellie. She had seen the truth of what happened at the river. She had seen a man choose grace over bloodshed, and her heart filled with a fierce, protective pride. The last vestiges of her fear of him were burned away, replaced by an unwavering loyalty. She refused to hide from the town's scorn. She stood by him. Their life on the homestead transformed. The wall between them, already cracked, crumbled into dust. They began to live and work as true partners. She learned to read the sky for rain, and he taught her how to sight down the barrel of a rifle. Not for hunting, but so she could protect herself. He would find her weeding the small vegetable garden she had planted, and he would work beside her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he pulled weeds from around the tender shoots. Their love deepened, quietly and steadily, like a river carving its way through stone. It was not a love of stolen glances and pretty words. It was a love born of shared pain and quiet endurance, a bond forged in the heat of survival. He started to talk more, telling her small things about the land, about the habits of the deer that came to drink at the creek. And one evening, as she told him a story about a clumsy calf that had tripped over its own feet, she heard it for the first time, a rough, rusty sound deep in his chest. He was laughing. The evenings became their time. They would sit on the small porch he had built, watching the sun bleed gold and crimson across the vast horizon. Sometimes they would not speak at all, but the silence was now a comfortable blanket, a shared space of peace. He would reach for her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers, and they would just sit together, two lonely souls who had found an anchor in each other. Their life was hard, their future uncertain, but for a few precious months, they found a quiet, simple happiness. Then tragedy struck, as it so often does when happiness feels most secure. It came on a hot, windy night in late summer. A thunderstorm was brewing on the horizon, the air thick and charged with electricity. Ellie had been up late, mending one of Luke's shirts by the light of a kerosene lantern, tired. She had set the lantern on a low crate near a pile of old canvases he used for patching the roof, and had gone to bed. She woke to a choking, acrid smell. Smoke. Her eyes flew open to an unbelievable sight. The wall near the crate was engulfed in a roaring sheet of orange flame. A gust of wind, forced through a chink in the log wall by the approaching storm, must have tipped the lantern. The dry canvases had caught instantly, and the fire was now consuming the old, dry wood of the cabin with a terrifying hunger. "Luke!" she screamed, scrambling from the bed. He was already awake, his face grim in the hellish, flickering light. "Get out! Ellie! Now!" he yelled over the roar of the flames. The smoke was thick, burning her lungs. Panic seized her. She ran for the door, stumbling through the heat and the blinding smoke. She burst out into the night air, gasping for breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was safe. She turned, expecting to see him right behind her, but he was not there. "Luke!" she screamed again, her voice raw with terror. Through the open doorway, she saw him silhouetted against the flames. He was not heading for the door. He was moving deeper into the burning cabin, towards the corner where the small wooden chest containing his mother's locket and her own Bible was kept. "No!" she shrieked. "Leave it!" But he was already lost in the swirling smoke and fire. A moment later, a section of the roof collapsed with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks and burning embers into the night sky. The cabin was an inferno. He was gone. A sob of pure agony tore from her throat. Then, just as she gave up all hope, a figure staggered out of the doorway, engulfed in flames. It was Luke. He was clutching the small chest to his body. He took 2 steps and collapsed onto the ground, a smoldering, unmoving heap. Forgetting her own safety, Ellie ran to him, beating at the flames on his clothes with her bare hands. She dragged him, inch by painful inch, away from the roaring heat of the burning cabin until they were a safe distance away. The homestead they had built, the small sanctuary of their shared love, burned to the ground behind them, its destruction a fiery monument to their stolen happiness. For weeks, Luke hovered in a twilight world between life and death. His back, shoulders, and arms were a testament to the fire's fury. Ellie nursed him with a desperate, tireless devotion. She constructed a crude lean-to against a rock outcropping, using salvaged pieces of canvas that had been stored away from the cabin. She kept his wounds clean with water from the creek and applied poultices of soothing herbs she found growing nearby. She hunted for small game, her hands shaking the first time she used the rifle, but her aim steady. She was his nurse, his provider, his protector. She tended to his body, but it was his spirit that worried her more. He was lost in a fevered haze of pain and memory, often crying out in his sleep. His words a jumbled mix of her name and another, Clara. One night, as she was changing his bandages by the light of a small campfire, his eyes flickered open. They were lucid for the first time in days. He looked at her smoke-stained face and hands raw from work, and a look of profound anguish crossed his features. "You deserve better than me, Ellie," he whispered, his voice a dry, cracking rasp. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. This was not the time for pity. This was the time for truth. She leaned closer, her hand gently touching his unburned cheek. "No, Luke," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "I deserve the truth." He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the soot on his temple. Her words had broken through the final barrier of his guilt. The dam of his long-held silence finally burst. "It was my fault," he began, his voice barely audible. "All of it." He told her everything, the words tumbling out in a broken, painful torrent. He had loved Clara, a singer at the saloon. He had wanted to marry her, to take her away from that life. But Jebediah Stokes, a man with a possessive and violent nature, considered her his property. He would not let her go. The night of the fire, Stokes, in a drunken rage, had set ablaze at the back of the saloon to trap Clara, to scare her into submission. Luke had fought his way through the smoke and flames to get to her. He found her cornered, terrified. He had tried to lead her out, but Stokes had come at them, a knife in his hand. "We fought," Luke whispered, his eyes squeezed shut against the memory. In the smoke, it was chaos. A lantern was knocked over. The fire was everywhere. He choked on a sob. "I tried to pull her away from a falling beam. I pulled too hard. She stumbled. She fell. Her head, it hit the edge of the bar." He stopped, his body shaking with the force of his remembered grief. "She died right there, in my arms. It was an accident. I was trying to save her, and I killed her." Ellie listened, her heart breaking for him, for the terrible, tragic weight he had carried alone for so long. "And Stokes?" she asked softly. "I killed him," Luke said, his voice flat and dead. "After she was gone, something in me broke. I picked up his knife, and I did not stop until he was dead. It was not a fight. It was a slaughter. The town thinks I killed him over her. But the truth is I killed him because I had already lost her, because of what I had done." The confession hung in the air between them, more devastating than the smoke from their ruined home. The truth was not a simple story of murder and revenge. It was a tragedy of love and accident, and a guilt so profound it had consumed a man's soul. Ellie finally had the truth she had asked for, and its weight was almost too much to bear. The truth, when it finally came, was a more brutal thing than any lie. Luke's confession did not bring Ellie peace, it shattered it. The whispered rumors in town had been a simple, ugly story of a man killing another over a woman. It was a tale as old as the hills, a narrative of jealousy and violence that she could, on some level, comprehend. But the reality was a tragedy of such twisted, accidental cruelty that it defied understanding. He had not killed for love, but had killed the one he loved in a desperate attempt to save her. A chasm opened between them, wider and deeper than any silence they had shared before. She continued to tend to his burns, her hands gentle and efficient, but her spirit withdrew. She would clean and bandage his wounds, prepare him broth, and ensure he was comfortable, all with a distant, mechanical precision. The warmth was gone from her touch, the light from her eyes. She was torn between two impossible truths. She loved the man who had shown her a quiet, profound tenderness, the man who had faced down his past and chosen mercy. But she was horrified by the man whose hands, however unintentionally, had brought about the death of another woman. The two men were one and the same, and the conflict was tearing her apart. Luke, emerging slowly from the fog of his pain, felt her withdrawal as keenly as a fresh wound. He had finally offered her the ugliest part of himself, the truth he had hidden from the world, and it had repulsed her. He saw the dutiful care in her hands, but he saw the horror in her eyes. He had survived the fire, but he was certain he had now lost her, and the thought was a pain far worse than any burn. News of their misfortune traveled on the wind to Redemption Gulch. The story of the fire was dramatic enough, but it was soon followed by a darker, more potent rumor. Caleb Stokes, nursing his wounded hand and his humiliated pride, had lingered in the territory, and he began to talk. He twisted Luke's confession into a new and more sinister shape. Hardin had admitted it himself. He would say in the saloon, he had killed Clara, then murdered Jebediah to cover his tracks. The fire that destroyed his cabin was divine judgment. The town, which had only recently begun to whisper that Hardin had gone soft, now seized upon this new narrative with a grim, self-righteous satisfaction. He was not weak. He was and always had been a monster. One afternoon, a wagon appeared at their ruined homestead. It was Reverend Miller, the same man who had performed their joyless wedding ceremony. He came bearing a basket of bread and a heavy mantle of pious concern. He looked with dismay at their crude lean-to, at the blackened scar where the cabin had been, and at Ellie's smoke-stained, weary face. "My child," he began, his voice oozing with a practiced sympathy. "The whole town is praying for you. To endure such hardship, it is a terrible trial." He glanced at Luke, who was sitting propped against the rock wall, his bandaged arms resting in his lap, his face a grim, silent mask. "We have heard troubling things, Eleanor. Stories about this man's past, about what he has admitted to." Ellie said nothing, her face impassive. "This is no life for a decent, God-fearing woman," the preacher continued, emboldened by her silence. "You are living in squalor with a man damned by his own sins. This is not a marriage, it is a penance. The town will take you in. Mrs. Pringle herself has offered you a room. You can come back to the fold. Child, leave this cursed place. Leave him. It is God's will." The preacher's words were meant to be a lifeline, an offer of salvation. But as Ellie listened, something inside her began to harden. She looked at the smarmy, judgmental face of the Reverend, a man who saw the world in simple terms of sin and salvation, black and white. And then she looked at Luke. She saw him not as the town saw him, not as a damned soul or a monster. She saw the raw, unending agony in his eyes. She understood, with a clarity that cut through her own confusion and horror, that his violence against Jebediah had not been cruelty. It was the desperate, broken rage of a man who had just lost everything in a single, horrific accident. She saw the boy he must have been, a boy who had loved a woman and tried to protect her, only to have his entire world burn down around him. She saw the man he had become, a man who had sentenced himself to a lifetime of silent penance, who had refused to fight for his own life but had been willing to die for hers. She saw his brokenness, and her own heart, which had been torn between love and horror, made its choice. She turned to the preacher, her eyes clear and cold. "My place is with my husband," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "He is a better man than any of you in that town will ever know. We do not need your prayers, and we do not want your pity." She pointed back down the track he had come. "You should go now." The Reverend stared, his mouth agape, shocked by her defiance. He stammered a few words about hellfire and damnation. Then, seeing the finality in her expression, he climbed back into his wagon and retreated, leaving a cloud of dust and indignation behind him. When he was gone, Ellie turned to Luke. He was staring at her, his face a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, fragile hope. She had chosen him. She had chosen their ruined, difficult life over the town's empty promises of comfort. She walked over to him, knelt down, and for the first time since his confession, she took his hand in hers. Not as a nurse, but as his wife. "We will rebuild," she said. It was a promise. From that day on, a new and formidable strength bloomed in Ellie. With Luke still too weak to do more than the lightest of tasks, she became the heart and soul of their survival. She took the rifle and began to hunt in earnest, her initial trepidation giving way to a grim competence. She learned to track, to read the signs of the land, to be patient and silent. She brought back rabbits and grouse, and one triumphant day, a young deer that would feed them for weeks. She became a builder. She salvaged what she could from the ashes of the cabin, charred tools, warped cooking pots, anything that had survived the inferno. She found a stand of young straight pines by the creek and, using Luke's axe, began the back-breaking work of felling them. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to construct a new, smaller shelter, a one-room cabin that was a testament to her sheer force of will. Luke watched her, humbled. He saw her hands, once soft and smooth, become calloused and strong. He saw the new confidence in her walk, the steady, determined set of her jaw. She was no longer just surviving. She was prevailing, and she was doing it for him. The love he felt for her was an agonizing, overwhelming thing, a feeling so immense it seemed too big for his scarred body to contain. As his strength returned, he began to help. At first, He could only do small things, like stripping the bark from the logs she dragged back to their building site. But soon, he was working beside her, his movements still stiff and pained, but his resolve matching hers. They worked in a comfortable, efficient silence. Two people with a single purpose. One afternoon, as they were fitting a log into place, he paused. He went to the salvage chest and took out his gun belt, the heavy leather and cold steel that had been a part of him for as long as he could remember. He held it for a long moment, then coiled it carefully and placed it back in the chest, burying it beneath his mother's locket and Ellie's Bible. "You will need that," Ellie said, watching him. He shook his head, his eyes meeting hers. They were clear. The haunted shadows receded into the background. "I am done with killing," he said simply. It was a vow. He was renouncing the man he had been, the man defined by violence and speed and death. He was choosing to be the man Ellie believed he was. A quiet, hard-won peace settled over them. They were rebuilding not just a home, but a life. But fate had one last trial for them, a final test of their newfound peace. They came at dusk, 3 riders materializing out of the purple twilight. It was the bandits. Ellie recognized the big, bearded man from the first attack, his face a mask of vengeful fury. He was flanked by the man who had run and a new, mean-looking outlaw with cold, dead eyes. They had come back for revenge. They surrounded the half-built cabin, their rifles held ready. "Hardin," the bearded man bellowed. "We have some unfinished business. You killed my friend. Tonight, I am going to return the favor." Luke instinctively reached for the pistol that was no longer on his hip. His body tensed. The old instincts, the muscle memory of 100 fights, screaming at him to react. He looked at the chest, at the gun buried within. He was torn. To take up the gun now would be to break his vow, to become the killer again. But to do nothing would be to watch them harm Ellie. Ellie saw the terrible conflict in his face. She saw him hesitate, caught between the man he was and the man he wanted to be. And in that moment, all her fear, all her doubts, all her pain, crystallized into a single, sharp point of absolute certainty. She knew what she had to do. While the bandits' attention was on Luke, she moved silently to the corner of the shelter where they kept the shotgun. Her hands did not tremble as she picked it up, the smooth wood of the stock and the cold steel of the barrel feeling solid and real. She checked that it was loaded. Then, she stepped out into the open, the heavy gun resting in the crook of her arm. She put herself directly between Luke and the 3 men. The bandits stopped, stunned into silence. They had come expecting a fight with a legendary gunman. They were not prepared for this. A woman, pale and slender in the fading light, standing against them with a shotgun. The bearded man recovered first, a look of contemptuous amusement on his face. "Well, look what we have here. The little lady wants to play soldier. Put that thing down before you hurt yourself, sweetheart." Ellie's hands were trembling now, the weight of the gun and the enormity of what she was doing finally hitting her. But she did not lower the weapon. She raised it, the twin barrels pointing directly at the man's chest. Her fear was a living thing, a wild bird beating its wings against her ribs. But something else was rising with it, something fiercer, stronger. It was the force of a love that had survived fire and death and truth, a courage she never knew she possessed. Her fear broke. It did not vanish, but it was consumed by this new, brilliant strength. "I am not afraid of you anymore," she said, and her voice did not shake. It was as steady and as clear as a bell, ringing out in the twilight. The words were for the bandits, but they were for everything. For the town, for the past, for the ghosts, for the memory of a girl named Clara. It was a declaration of her own hard-won freedom. The bandits hesitated, unnerved by her stillness, by the absolute conviction in her voice. This was not the kind of fight they had come for. Behind her, Luke, who had finally retrieved his pistol, watched her. He saw her standing there, so fierce and fragile and strong, and a wave of understanding so profound it was almost painful washed over him. He had spent his life believing that his role was to be the protector, the shield, the purveyor of violence in the name of safety. But he saw now that strength was not just about the speed of a draw or the willingness to kill. He saw her courage, and he understood that she was not a victim he needed to save. She was his partner, his equal. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his own gun. He let it hang by his side, his eyes fixed on her, an expression of complete trust and boundless love on his face. This final, unexpected act was what broke the bandit's nerve. A woman who would not back down, and a gunman who would not fight. It made no sense. It was a kind of crazy they did not want to face. The bearded man stared for another moment, then cursed under his breath, wheeled his horse around, and galloped off into the darkness, his two companions right behind him. They were gone. Ellie stood there for a long moment, the shotgun still raised, her body thrumming with the aftermath of her courage. Then, her strength gave out, and she began to shake. The heavy gun slipped from her grasp. Before it could hit the ground, Luke was there. He caught the shotgun and gently took it from her, setting it aside. Then he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. She buried her face in his chest, and he held her, not as a savior holding the person he had rescued, but as an equal holding his partner, his other half, in the quiet, breathless aftermath of a shared victory. The silence that descended after the bandits fled was heavier than any sound. The night was still. The only noise, the whisper of the wind through the half-built walls of their new home and the frantic beating of Ellie's own heart. She stood in the circle of Luke's arms, her body still trembling, the phantom weight of the shotgun, a ghost in her hands. He held her, his grip solid and reassuring, and they just stood there for a long time. Two solitary figures in the vast, moonlit expanse of the plains, the ruins of their past smoldering behind them. They were alive, they were together, and in the quiet, breathless space of that aftermath, everything had changed. Luke looked down at the top of her head, her hair smelling of wood smoke in the cool night air. A realization, profound and shattering, washed over him. When the bandits had come, his first instinct, the instinct of a lifetime, had been to meet violence with violence. He had reached for his gun, ready to break his vow, ready to become the killer once more, all to protect her. But she had not needed his protection, not in that way. She had stood in front of him, a shield not made of steel but of a courage so fierce it had turned back the darkness. He realized then that she had saved him, not just from the bandits' bullets, but from the far more dangerous enemy within himself. She had saved him from his own past, from the man he had been, from the ghosts that had driven him to a life of violence and isolation. He touched the scars that ridged his arms and back, the permanent reminder of the fire that had taken their home. He understood now that he had been trapped in a different kind of fire his entire adult life, a fire of guilt and self-hatred. And Ellie, with her quiet strength and unwavering love, had walked into those flames and pulled him out. In the days and weeks that followed, they began to rebuild. But the work was different this time. Before, it had been a frantic, desperate scramble for survival. Now, it was a slow, humble, and deliberate act of creation. They worked with a new kind of rhythm, a partnership that needed few words. He would lift the heavy logs, his movements still careful because of his healing back, and she would be there to guide them into place. She would mix the mud and straw for the chinking, and he would apply it, his large hands surprisingly deft. Their bond was no longer built on the unstable ground of fear and obligation, or even on the fiery passion born of shared danger. It was now settled on the bedrock of shared pain and a deep, abiding forgiveness. They had seen the worst of each other, his violent past, her initial fear and withdrawal, and they had not turned away. The silences that fell between them now were not empty or tense, but full of a comfortable, unspoken understanding. He would watch her as she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration, and a feeling of overwhelming love would well up in his chest, so powerful it almost hurt. She would catch his eye across the building site, and he would offer her a small, slow smile, a thing that no longer looked strange on his face, and she would feel a sense of peace so profound it felt like coming home. As summer faded into the crisp, golden days of autumn, their new cabin was completed. It was smaller than the first, with only one room and a single window that faced the sunrise. But it was theirs. Every log, every stone in the hearth, was a testament to their shared will. It was not just a shelter, it was a home, filled with a warmth that came not just from the fire, but from the quiet love that now defined their lives. When the first snows of winter threatened, they knew they needed to make a trip to Redemption Gulch for supplies to see them through the season. The last time they had ridden into town, they had been met with scorn and open hostility. Ellie felt a familiar knot of anxiety as they approached the main street. But something was different. The story of the final standoff with the bandits had made its way to town, carried by a passing trapper who had heard the tale from one of the outlaws himself in a distant saloon. It was a strange, unbelievable story that contradicted everything the town thought it knew about Luke Hardin and his timid wife, the feared gunman who had refused to draw his weapon, the forced bride who had stood down 3 armed men with nothing but a shotgun and a steady voice. As they rode down the street, people still stopped to stare, but the looks were no longer purely contemptuous. There was a new expression in their eyes, a grudging respect, a baffled awe. They saw Ellie, not as a pale victim, but as a woman of formidable strength. They saw Luke, not as a fearsome killer, but as a man who had, for some inexplicable reason, laid down his arms. At the general store, Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, gave them a stiff but respectful nod. He tallied up their supplies, flour, salt, coffee, and ammunition for hunting. When he gave them the total, it was noticeably less than it should have been. "Good winter to you, Hardin," he said, not quite meeting Luke's eyes. "To you too, Mrs. Hardin." It was a small gesture, but it was significant. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. On their way out of town, they passed Mrs. Gable, the widow Luke had helped months before. She was with her children, and she stopped, a genuine, warm smile spreading across her face. "Mrs. Hardin," she said, her voice full of sincere warmth. "It is good to see you looking so well." They were no longer outcasts. They had not been forgiven by the town, for the town did not understand what they had endured. But they had earned something more valuable, respect. They had become a local legend, a strange and cautionary tale of redemption and resilience that the people of Redemption Gulch would tell for years to come. The story of the forced bride and the outlaw who had somehow, against all odds, found peace on the unforgiving plains. The winter that followed was harsh. The landscape once again locked in snow and ice, but inside their small, sturdy cabin, there was only warmth and peace. They were cut off from the world, but they were not lonely. They had each other. One evening, as a bitter wind howled outside, they sat by the fire. The sky through the window was a deep, star-dusted indigo, the same kind of frozen sky under which their story had so terrifyingly begun. Ellie rose and went to the wooden chest that held their few precious belongings. She opened the lid and took out Luke's old gun belt. The leather was worn, the holster molded to the shape of the pistol it had held for so many years. She brought it over to the small table and laid it down, the metal buckle making a soft, final sound against the wood. She looked at Luke, her eyes full of a quiet, powerful love. "It is over," she said softly. He looked from the empty holster to her face. He understood what she meant. The fighting, the running, the ghosts of Jebediah and Clara, the long war he had waged against himself. It was all finally over. He was no longer the man who needed that gun. He reached out and gently touched her face, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His eyes were clear, filled with a peace that was so deep and absolute it seemed to radiate from him. He nodded slowly, a single, solemn gesture of acceptance. He was a man finally at peace with his own soul. The final scene of their story unfolded not in winter, but in the full, glorious bloom of the following spring. The plains were alive with color, a sea of green grass dotted with the vibrant hues of wildflowers. The sky was a vast, brilliant blue, stretching from one horizon to the other. They rode together, their horses moving at an easy pace across the open land. The sun was low behind them, bleeding gold and orange and purple into the evening sky. Luke was no longer the silent, haunted figure who had met her in the snow. He rode easy in the saddle, his shoulders relaxed, his eyes taking in the beauty of the world around him. Ellie rode beside him, her face turned towards the setting sun, a quiet smile on her lips. The land that had once been her prison, a symbol of her isolation and terror, was now a vista of breathtaking freedom. It was a freedom they had earned, a peace they had fought for not with guns, but with endurance and forgiveness, and a stubborn refusal to be broken. Their love was not the innocent, fairy tale kind. It was a thing of scars and calloused hands and shared, painful memories. It was a love that had been forged in fear, tested by fire, and tempered by guilt. It was fragile, yet unbreakable. A quiet, resilient thing that had survived the cruelty of the world and the darkness within their own hearts. It was real. As they rode, the memory of her voice from that fateful night echoed softly in the quiet spaces between them, the words that had become the foundation of their new life. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." He turned to her then, and a genuine, unguarded smile lit up his face, chasing away the last of the old shadows. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand in his, their fingers lacing together. He was a man redeemed, and she was the woman who had led him home. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. And we invite you to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.